The IMF African loan trap refers to the situation where African countries become heavily dependent on loans from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, leading to ongoing debt and economic challenges. In the 1960s and 1970s, after gaining independence, many African countries faced severe economic problems like budget deficits, high inflation, and balance of payment issues. To address these problems, they turned to the IMF for financial assistance. The IMF provided loans, but with strict conditions, known as structural adjustment programs, SAPs, which required the countries to implement austerity measures, reduce government spending, and privatize state-owned enterprises. These conditions often lead to economic hardship, increased poverty, and a cycle of continuous borrowing, creating what is perceived as a loan trap. For instance, Ghana was one of the first African countries to engage with the IMF in the 1980s. The country faced severe economic decline and needed immediate financial intervention. The IMF provided loans but required Ghana to implement austerity measures, reduce government spending, and privatize state-owned enterprises. These conditions were meant to stabilize the economy, but also led to significant social and economic hardships for the population. Nigeria, another large African nation, also sought IMF assistance during the same period. The country's economy was suffering from mismanagement and external debt. The IMF's involvement required Nigeria to undertake structural adjustments, which included removing subsidies and liberalizing trade. While these measures aimed to improve economic stability, they also resulted in increased unemployment and higher prices for essential goods, causing widespread dissatisfaction among the populace. Similarly, Zambia turned to the IMF in the 1980s and 1990s to manage its economic crises. The IMF's conditions for loans involved significant restructuring of the economy, including the privatization of key industries. Although these reforms were intended to create a more market-oriented economy, they often led to job losses and reduced public services, exacerbating poverty and inequality. Kenya and Tanzania also engaged with the IMF to address their economic challenges. Both countries had to implement structural adjustment programs that included austerity measures and privatization. These programs were controversial as they often resulted in social unrest due to cuts in public spending on health, education, and other essential services. In recent years, countries like South Africa sought IMF assistance due to specific crises, such as the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The IMF provided emergency funding to help manage the economic fallout, but the long-term effects and conditions of these loans continue to be a topic of debate. Overall, the IMF's involvement in African countries has been a double-edged sword. While the financial assistance helped stabilize economies in the short term, the stringent conditions often led to economic hardship for the general population. This has led to criticism that the IMF's policies prioritize financial stability over social welfare, creating a cycle of debt dependency and economic challenges for many African nations. The consequences faced by African countries after engaging with the IMF and implementing its structural adjustment programs were significant and multifaceted. While these programs aimed to stabilize economies and promote long-term growth, they often led to a range of adverse outcomes. One of the most immediate consequences was economic hardship for the general population. The austerity measures required by the IMF typically involved cutting government spending on social services, such as healthcare, education, and public infrastructure. This reduction in spending led to a decline in the quality and availability of essential services, disproportionately affecting the poorest segments of society. For instance, in countries like Ghana and Zambia, cuts in health and education budgets resulted in increased disease prevalence and lower literacy rates. Public hospitals and schools struggled with inadequate funding, leading to overcrowded classrooms and a lack of medical supplies and personnel. Privatization of state-owned enterprises, another common condition of IMF loans, led to significant job losses. These enterprises often employed large numbers of people, and their privatization resulted in layoffs as new private owners sought to reduce costs. The increased unemployment contributed to higher levels of poverty and social discontent. In Nigeria, for example, the privatization of key industries led to substantial layoffs, worsening the already high unemployment rate. Similarly, in Kenya, the reduction of subsidies and government spending resulted in higher costs for basic goods and services, pushing more people into poverty. Many African countries found themselves trapped in a cycle of debt dependency. Instead of achieving sustainable growth, they had to borrow more money to service existing debts, leading to an ever-increasing debt burden. High interest payments on these loans further strained national budgets, leaving less money available for development projects and essential services. Zambia is a notable example, where the country's debt continued to grow despite multiple rounds of IMF assistance. The need to service existing debt left Zambia with limited resources to invest in its own development, perpetuating economic stagnation. The economic hardships and increased poverty resulting from IMF-imposed austerity measures often led to social and political unrest. In many cases, the population's dissatisfaction with deteriorating living standards and reduced access to essential services sparked protests and strikes. Governments faced significant pressure to address these grievances, sometimes resulting in political instability. In Tanzania, for instance, the implementation of structural adjustment programs led to widespread public discontent, with protests and strikes becoming more frequent as people demanded better living conditions and government accountability. While some countries managed to stabilize their economies and eventually saw positive outcomes from the structural adjustments, the long-term economic impact often remained mixed. The focus on austerity and rapid market liberalization sometimes stunted industrial growth and limited the country's ability to develop diversified economies. In South Africa, the economic reforms and IMF assistance during the COVID-19 pandemic helped mitigate immediate financial crises, but the long-term challenges of unemployment and inequality remain pressing issues. Following the challenges and criticisms faced by the IMF in the 1980s and 1990s, particularly regarding its programs in African countries, the organization underwent significant changes. These criticisms highlighted the negative impacts of austerity measures, such as increased poverty and reduced access to essential services, prompting the IMF to reconsider its approach. In response, the IMF began to revise its policies to place greater emphasis on social protection and poverty reduction. Recognizing the importance of maintaining social spending even during economic adjustments, the IMF introduced new guidelines to protect expenditures on health, education, and social safety nets. This shift aimed to mitigate the adverse impacts on vulnerable populations and make economic reforms more sustainable. The IMF also made its conditionality more flexible, tailoring requirements to the specific circumstances of borrowing countries. This approach was intended to ensure that reforms were not only economically sound, but also politically feasible. Additionally, the IMF launched initiatives focused on poverty reduction, integrating these strategies into national economic programs. Collaboration with other international organizations, such as the World Bank, became more pronounced. By combining efforts, the IMF aimed to address broader development challenges, leveraging the World Bank's focus on development projects and social programs alongside its own expertise in macroeconomic policy. To improve transparency and accountability, the IMF made efforts to enhance its governance. This included more open communication about its policies and decisions, greater involvement of member countries in decision-making, and increased publication of information about its programs and their outcomes. Despite these reforms, the IMF continued to face challenges. The global financial crisis of 2008-2009 brought renewed scrutiny of its role in managing economic crises, highlighting the need for further reforms in the global financial system and raising questions about the IMF's adaptability. In recent years, the IMF has played a critical role in addressing global economic challenges, such as the economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. By providing emergency financing to numerous countries, the IMF helped manage the health crisis and its economic fallout. This response underscored the IMF's evolving role in providing rapid support during crises while maintaining a focus on social and economic stability. The IMF has also increasingly addressed issues such as climate change and inclusive growth, recognizing that sustainable development requires a holistic approach that includes environmental sustainability and social equity. In summary, the IMF's journey following its controversial programs in Africa has been one of significant introspection and reform. While it has made strides in adopting a more flexible and socially conscious approach, it continues to navigate complex global economic landscapes, balancing the goals of macroeconomic stability with human development and poverty reduction. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more videos.